Even though we are located in different parts of the world, I would like to formally begin our event tonight by acknowledging that the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Today's event is part of our City Reassembled series, a series of seminars, conversations, and associated events to explore the past, present, and future of the Hong Kong diaspora. This series and this webinar tonight is organized by us, the UBC Hong Kong Studies Initiative, and it's co-sponsored by many units on campus, and we are very grateful to them. The Department of Asian Studies, the Department of History, the Center for Chinese Research, the Center for Migration Studies, Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies, Public Humanities Hub, and the Interdisciplinary Histories Research Cluster. Seems like a lot of units, but I'm particularly grateful to them because these campus academic units on campus, they value and they recognize the importance of Hong Kong studies, and they have been very supportive of our work. I also want to take this opportunity to welcome my new colleague, Dr. Helena Wu, who has just joined the Department of Asian Studies as Assistant Professor of Hong Kong Studies. So now let me briefly introduce Professor Lian Yizheng, our speaker tonight. Professor Joseph Lian was born and raised in Hong Kong. He obtained his BA in mathematics from Carleton College in Minnesota and his PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota. Professor Lian was from 1998 to 2004, a senior policy advisor and speechwriter for Dong Chi-hua, the first chief executive of the Hong Kong SAR government. And he was, for a number of years, a chief editor and lead writer of the Hong Kong Economic Journal, the city's, at that time, premier business newspaper. Professor Lian has taught at Tulane University in Louisiana, the University of California in Riverside, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and Akita International University. And he's now a professor of economics at the International College of Liberal Arts at Yamanashi Gakuin University. Professor Lian has published widely in academic and professional outlets, and he has written extensively on Hong Kong and China-related issues, perhaps most notably as a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Lian.
Thank you, Professor Xin, for the introduction. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk to a very distinguished audience at UBC and also from the wider Vancouver community and beyond. Being a member of the Chinese Hong Kong Diaspora, I first became interested in this issue about what happens in the diaspora, what would be the impacts of world events on the welfare of the members of these diaspora, etc. And recent events, the tension between the US and also China in places such as the Taiwan Strait, Hong Kong, etc., has also heightened my curiosity about the issues confronting the diasporas. So it is to me, it is a very personal as well as an important intellectual topic. And so I have started reading and thinking about the relevant issues several years ago. And the presentation that I'm going to make today is part of this learning process. I have certain questions about the diaspora, and I'm going to ask those questions, and hopefully some in the audience can enlighten me on those questions. The talk would be rather informal, and I'm going to use of different means to present the ideas. Sometimes I'm going to use the share screen to show you some slides. Other times I'm going to write something, doodle something on the whiteboard. You don't have to do anything. You just look at the screen, whereas I switch from one mode of presentation to another. So let me try out the various presentation channels first. So this is the set of slides that I'm going to show from time to time. And I have occasion to switch over to using the whiteboard, all right? So this is the whiteboard. Okay, so everything's in order. So let me begin. The main theme of my talk is that the tension arising between the two superpowers of today, China and the US, is going to drive the events relevant to the diasporas of the Chinese people and also of the Hong Kong people. The approach that I'm going to use is mainly historical. Now, this may sound a bit preposterous. I'm an economist and I'm talking in front of a professor of history and his colleagues. So I better be a little bit cautious and be ready to admit whatever shortcomings there may be in my preparation regarding historical materials and my arguments based on them. All right. So basically, this is the stage, and on the stage you have 4 actors. You have the US, you have China, you have the Chinese diaspora, and also the Hong Kong diaspora. Very often I would be mistaken and pronounce this as Hong Kong dollar, but no, Hong Kong diaspora, right? So tension between these two countries, right? These two countries will drive the events that will occur and be witnessed in the diasporas. So this is the general setting. Now, as to how and why the tensions would arise within between the two countries, I am going to use the historical approach. For China, it's because it has such a long history. So I rely on long historical patterns. For the US, which has a very short history, I'm going to use 2 episodes from its recent history, mainly in the period 1917 to 1954, and also the Second World War. But before I do that, let me take a quick look at the 2 diasporas, right? So let us just briefly look at the relevant details of the 2 diasporas. So here is the Chinese diaspora. Well, it has a very, very long history of measured in terms of centuries, right? But we're not going to look at that long a history. We're going to just look at some of the details of the features of diaspora relevant for this presentation. The first is its size, right? Different numbers can be found in the literature, varying from 43 million to some 60 million, depending on how you count. This is a 2014 figure provided by a government agency in Taiwan. If we include the people in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau, that number goes up to probably 60, right? Now, in the year 1993, an authority on the Chinese diaspora, Professor Wang Gengwu, Gao Shou, he gave a figure of 23 million, right? Now, even if we use the lower number for the current size, around 45 million, something like that, within 30 years, there was a doubling of the size of the Chinese diaspora in the world. All right, so the growth is very quick. Now, if we take a comparative look, the size of the Jewish diaspora today is around 18 million. So this is the Jewish diaspora. All right. So if you, the Chinese diaspora is therefore almost 3 times as large as the Jewish diaspora. All right, so it's one of the, in fact, it is one of the biggest diasporas in the world today, although it's not the biggest. According to some studies, Mexico has the largest community of its citizens and their descendants in other parts of the world today outside Mexico, and that was probably the biggest diaspora. But the Chinese diaspora is in any kind of rankings would be one of the top 5, right, or sometimes top 3. So it's a very significant in size. Now, if we measure the number of people born in China, but have become the member of the Chinese diaspora, in other words, immigrants coming out from China who are still living, then the number is 10 million, right? 10 million born in China, right? 10 million born in China. So it's about 1/4 and so the addition, the rate of addition is very high. All right. We can also make another comparison. Let's say look at the number of Chinese, ethnic Chinese in the U.S. born in China, right? In the U.S., so that's 2.4 million. And these are the people, ethnic Chinese people born in China, living in the U.S., right? 2.4 million. It is significantly bigger than, for example, the Japanese diaspora, members of the Japanese diaspora in the United States. All right. So in the U.S., it's the size of the Chinese diaspora, members of them born in China, is several times as large as the Japanese diaspora community. Now, another feature of importance of the Chinese diaspora is a very strong transnationalism. Well, we know what nationalism means, right? Nationalistic feelings. But when these people migrate to other countries and become members of the diaspora, they bring along their nationalism with them. And that nationalism is about identification and sentimental attachment to their mother country, right? So this kind of transnationalism implies that many of the members of the diaspora have split loyalty, right? Now, ordinarily, that doesn't matter, right? Split loyalty. But in times of national crisis appearing between the host country and the mother country, this kind of split loyalty can become very problematic, right? The two distinguishing features of the Chinese diaspora that I'm going to focus on is its size, and secondly, its strong transnationalism among members of the diaspora. This is actually not a very new feature of the Chinese diaspora. If you go back, let's say 100 years in history, you know that the overseas Chinese were said to be very patriotic, and they helped in the founding of the Chinese Republic in the Revolution of 1911, right? So that was an early manifestation of strong transnationalism within the Chinese diaspora, right? Now, let me say a few things about the Hong Kong diaspora. Currently, it measures about 1 million, right? So the actual size is quite small compared with the Chinese diaspora. And before maybe 2019 or maybe 2020, the Hong Kong diaspora is unmistakably an integral, although differentiated, part of the Chinese diaspora, right? So this is part of the Chinese diaspora. But recent events have driven a very drastic change within the community of Hong Kong people living overseas. So post, right? And post 2020, it has taken on a new separate identity, right? So this is the Chinese diaspora. Originally, the Hong Kong diaspora was part of it, right? And now you have this kind of situation. And there is a clear differentiation of the two diasporas, and this has become, or is becoming, a totally new member of the diasporas in the world, right? And one distinguishing feature of the Hong Kong diaspora is that members of the new, the nascent Hong Kong diaspora has a very strong Hong Kong identity, which is in contrast to the Chinese identity that members of the Chinese diaspora retain. All right. So this is the change that has taken place within the last year or two, and of course it's driven by events happening in the city, right? And we all know that. Professor Wang Gengwu, in his 1993 essay, mentioned that the politics in the diasporan communities are very, very often driven by the events back home in the mother country, all right? So this is exactly what's happening, right? So these are all the main features of the two diasporas that I need to use to work on for this presentation. Although, of course, the stories of the Chinese diaspora, of the Hong Kong diaspora, are very, very rich. And those of you who would want to look more into these diasporas are referred to specialized studies done by scholars in the field, right? Now I want to look at the factors that are driving the current tension in the between the two countries, the US and China. First, I focus on China. And I would like to look at some long historical patterns of behavior, right? So long historical . Now, at this point, I would like to emphasize a particular, excuse me, a particular viewpoint that I have concerning modern China and its ruling party, the Communist Party of China. In the majority of the opinion regarding China, it is said that it is often emphasized that the Chinese Communist Party is a Marxist-Leninist party, right? And that throughout its history, one can observe a pattern that it is anti-Chinese culture, right? And the best examples used to emphasize that point, to prove that point, is the event known as the Cultural Revolution, in which all kinds of crazy people tried very hard to destroy the Chinese culture, All right. I take a very different view. My view is the Chinese Communist Party is very Chinese, right? It's very Chinese. All of its behavior, all of its techniques, strategies have very ancient parallels in Chinese history, right? And so if we want to understand the behavior of Communist China and the Chinese Communist Party, we need to have a good understanding of what kind of cultural elements that the Chinese Communist Party has retained, and what kind of strategies, tactics, and cultural wisdoms that the party has embraced and used to its advantage, right? So I take that view. China and the CCP are very Chinese, right? Now, some would say, oh, that would present a political problem. So if we criticize China and the CCP, we are also criticizing the Chinese culture. Well, that may well be the case, right? Chinese culture is very rich, very diverse. It really depends on what strand or what strains of the Chinese culture the Communist Party of China are operating on, right? So by criticizing or even some of us would praising China, we're not looking at the entire Chinese culture, right? Now the elements of Chinese culture and Chinese historical background that I want to look at are from the ancient Chinese concept of territorial possession. And secondly, the ancient Chinese empire model. And the third element is who counts as Chinese. Now, for the first question, let me go to the slides. Now, the Chinese territorial concept, right? It's mainly based on the theory of ancient possession, right? From that, it justifies its expansionist behavior. The term in political science referring to that kind of behavior is irredentism. Right? Irredentism. You say that, oh, a piece of territory used to be mine in the distant past, therefore it should also belong to me now, right? So this kind of argument or this kind of thinking is called irredentism in political science. Now, if you look at Chinese pronouncements, you can easily find examples of irredentism. For example, several years ago, the Chinese Defense Ministry published an article to lay claim on the various islands in the South China Sea. And its main argument was this: the various islands in the South China Sea have been Chinese territory since ancient times, right? 南海諸島自古以來就是中國領土。The catchphrase here is 自古以來, since ancient times, right? Now, how ancient? We can refer to a historical example. In the year 645, the second emperor of the Tang dynasty, Tang Taizong, right? One of the most revered and capable and respected emperors in Chinese history, right? He was, in that year, he was preparing a military expedition against Korea, right? He wanted to claim some parts of Korea, the northern half of Korea, and he prepared for it militarily. And before he set out, he spoke to his officials, and he said that part of the world belonged to ancient China. But throughout the dynasties, from Zhao to Ngai, they have been neglected. Today, there's stability in the 9 oceans, except this little corner, right? So the idea is, well, it belonged to us. And since we have claimed or subjugated most of the rest of the universe, right? The remainder is this little part that we also want to claim, right? Now he mentioned ancient China, right? And he said it in the year 645. And what ancient China was he referring to? Well, it was about some events recorded in ancient Chinese history books that occurred in the year around the years 1700 before the Christian era, right? So between Tang Taizong mentioned this and the event that he referred to, about 2,500 years have passed, right? So he was referring to ancient possession in that sense. Now you see that his wording has a very strong parallel in the kind of Chinese statements used today, right? Well, if you look at the history of the countries around China, right, South Korea and Vietnam, at one time or another, they had been ruled by China. At other times, they were so-called tributary states, right? Chinese are familiar with the idea of concession, 周改, right? And there was concessions in Chinese cities like Shanghai or Guangzhou or other major cities throughout the 19th century. And these were areas within cities taken over by imperialist, foreign imperialist countries and ruled according to their laws, right? So that there was this concept of extraterritoriality operating in the concessions in different Chinese cities when China was under the influence or the pressure of the imperialist countries in the 19th century. But don't forget, China also operated concessions in Korea, and there were 3 such in the cities of Incheon, Busan, and Wonsan, right? Separately in the northern half, in the middle part, and the southern Korea. And they ceased to operate as concessions only in the year 1913, right? So that was the situation in Korea. Now, if you look at Vietnam, Vietnam was ruled by China since the beginning of the Christian era for about 1,000 years. And then it became a tributary state from the 14th century to the year 1841, just before the French took over, right? Now, so if China uses ancient possession as a pretext to claim to extend its territories and make territorial claims, all the countries around China, Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, etc., would be affected, all right? So this is one of the main drivers between China and the other countries in the world today, right? Now, the US claims that it is the defender of the existing world order, right? But faced with this kind of behavior coming from China, it has to react, right? And so we are seeing some of that happening. For example, the Indo-Pacific initiatives spearheaded by the several administrations in the US is one of them, right? Now, but let me, oh, where is the button? All right. Here, clear. All right. Now, the second thing I want to talk about from Chinese history that has a bearing on today's state behavior of China is the empire model. It's the ancient empire model. Right. Now, many of us are not aware that China was an empire, right? Now, in political science, empire means one people, the dominant people, ruling over other peoples, and they become one political unit, right? This is in contrast to a simple nation state, right? This is one nation state, this is another nation state, and they are sort of independent. One people, one country, one people, one country. Here, the different peoples form one empire, ruled over by a dominant people. So this is the empire, right? This is nation state. Now, the ancient Chinese empire model was called the 5 subjugations, right? The 5 subjugations. Let me show this on a slide. Well, in the previous slide, I mentioned this, the 9 oceans, right? That the emperor of Tang, the second emperor of Tang Dynasty mentioned, the 9 oceans. The 9 oceans have now been stabilized, all right? What does that mean? What's the 9 oceans? Well, the 9 oceans are ancient historiographical term referring to the mythical oceans surrounding the Middle Kingdom, all right? All parts of an ancient Chinese empire model. The model itself is known as the 5 subjugations, 5 levels of subjugations, put it that way, and was first introduced in an ancient Confucian classical text called the Sheng Xu, the Book of Documents, which was authored by scholars at least 5 centuries before the beginning of the Christian era. or it could have been even earlier. And one volume in the book of documents called the Yu Gong was about economic political geography. And it delineates the empire model. And the description is the following. The emperor's domain is in the middle, surrounded by 4 concentric bands of territories, each 500 li wide, 500里一幅, with the emperor's power radiating but decreasing outwards. And the defined tributes payable by the surrounding tributary states to the emperor also would be decreasing outwards. Now, this is critical. The 5th, or the outermost band, called the remote subjugation, 防府, actually has no outer boundary. And it would expand and contract with the military might of the Middle Kingdom. Now, this model gives structure to the concept of Tinha, under the heaven, right? Mentioned in another ancient text in the following way. Under the heaven, all land belongs to the emperor, governing to the ocean's edge. All officials submit to the emperor's will, all right? So this is the political structure of the ancient Chinese empire model. Now, in that classical text, it also gave clear expression to China's version of the white man's burden. We know what this is, right? White man's burden. It was a term invented by a British writer, Rudyard Kipling, right? Now, in that ancient Chinese text, it describes the role of the Chinese empire. East, reaching the waters, west to the shifting sands, and in the north and in the south, the civilizing voices of the empire reach the 4 seas. And the civilizing voices of the empire, right? So that's the Chinaman's burden. Well, so it is a very flexible empire model. It can expand and it can contract according to the military might that the center can project onto its peripheries, right? The third element from Chinese history and Chinese culture that I want to draw upon is the definition of the Chinese. Who counts as Chinese? All right, who counts as Chinese? Now, there are definitions, the different kinds of definitions, legal definitions, for example, but I'm going to use the cultural definition, right? Well, Xi Jinping in 2017 spoke the following to a very important visitor to China, President Trump, right? So one day when they were walking around the ancient palaces in Beijing, Xi Jinping made the following comment. The Chinese, they are like us, yellow skins, black hair. He was referring to himself, right? And that can be traced back for 5,000 years. We call ourselves the descendants of the dragon, right? So that was recorded in a CCTV video. You can check it out. This is technically, legally, an incorrect statement, right? But it is the most common view espoused by the ordinary Chinese, right? Whenever there is a need to, the view would switch from this one to the technically correct one, right? So sometimes you see different versions of the definition of a Chinese. Now, this view of what counts as the Chinese is based on physical characteristics, right? Actually, within the Chinese culture, there's a different approach to define Chineseness, and that was attributable to Confucius. It's a very modern, a very enlightened approach, right? It is a values approach. Confucius was said to have made the claim that if you subscribed to our values and rituals, then you are a Chinese. If you don't, you are a barbarian, right? So that was the kind of approach used by Confucius, a values approach, cultural values approach. Now, but this approach based on physical characteristics is both very exclusive and very inclusive. It is exclusive because it leaves out the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Taiwan Aborigines that have different skin colors and hair colors, right? And they speak different languages and have different religions, and they don't consider themselves descendants of the dragon, right? So in that sense, this statement is clearly too exclusive. And from the mouth of a Chinese leader, that is very problematic. But it is also very inclusive because these physical characteristics apply to all overseas Chinese, members of the Chinese diaspora. So if needs be, members of the Chinese diaspora, even though they may have assimilated into other cultures, even if they have become citizens of foreign countries, they can be regarded as Chinese, right? So this is a potentially problematic factor affecting the relationship between China and the rest of the countries in the world, especially the US, which has one of the biggest presence of ethnic Chinese people, right? Okay, now I have the elements ready for describing the sources of the tension coming from the Chinese side. Now let us look at the US side. Again, I'm taking a historical approach, and I look at two periods in US history, which is of course much shorter than Chinese history, right? The first period or the first episodes regard the Soviet threat, right? And the period I want to focus at is from 1917, when the Russians had their communist revolution, up to the period, up to the year 1954, when the US Congress passed the Communist Control Act of 1954, right? The other episode in US history that I want to focus on regards a threat coming from Japan, and that was the Pearl Harbor incident in World War II. It's not 1942, it's 1941. It occurred in December of 1941. But the events, the repercussions, the immediate consequences of the Pearl Harbor incident occurred in 1942, right? In February of that year, the president of the United States, Roosevelt, issued Executive Order 9066, and that led to the internment of Japanese Americans, right? So the Soviet threat culminating in the Communist Control Act of 1954, as well as a period in US political history characterized by what is called McCarthyism, This is the first historical episode I want to look at. And then the second one is this, right? The Soviet threat came in two concentrated doses. The first one was was immediately related to the events of the Russian Revolution and the First World War. In the year 1919, within the United States, there was severe labor unrests, race riots, and terrorism that could be traced to communists, socialists, and anarchists, individuals and organizations. So there was this Seattle general strike in which 65,000 members of the working class participated, and it lasted 5 days. And then there was the Boston police strike. 72% of 1,500 policemen participated, resulting in 9 being killed, right? And then there was this Cleveland May Day riots. 2 people killed, 116 arrested, mostly immigrants. Now this was significant. And nationwide, there was a steel workers strike with 365,000 participants. And then more seriously, coal miners in 21 states, 400,000 of them, comprising 60% of the total number of coal miners in the US, struck for 40 days, right? And there were race riots in more than 20 cities. There were dozens of people killed, right? And to cap it all, there was a sequence of anarchist bombings, right? Huge bombs, some of them 25 pounds of dynamite were sent to politicians, officials, journalists, business people, judges, ministers, all over the country, and several of them were killed, right? Now, all these events occurred in the year 1919, right? So America was in utter chaos. And how did the government react? Well, they made a lot of arrests. More than 3,000 people were arrested who took part in the riots and organized strikes were deported. And it resulted in the Immigration Act of 1924, which, among other things, excluded Asian. And then in the various states, the legislatures worked through time and made a number of those silly laws called red flag laws, which would outlaw the use of red flags in all kinds of demonstrations and civic actions. Very stupid. But things fizzled out after the May of that year, when an uprising, which was predicted to occur all over the country to overthrow the government, failed to materialize, right? So when events have died down, there was a comment in the Christian Science Monitor summing things up. What appeared to be an excess of radicalism was certainly met with an excess of suppression, right? So that was one way of looking at it. And later narratives summed it up and used the phrase, the Red Scare, the first Red Scare of 1919, 1920, right, to describe this episode in US history. Now, the second dose of Soviet infiltration and threats occurred during the Second World War, immediately before and during the Second World War, right? We recall that at one point, the Soviet Union and America were fighting side by side as allies. And As a result of that, the Soviet Union was able to send a lot of its agents into Europe and also into the US. And so there were a lot of infiltrations. I list the more serious ones, more well-known ones here. Well, maybe not all the most well-known ones. I have missed at least a couple. But here, let's go down the list. Jones Orrin York, Douglas aircraft engineer, passed on classified fighter aircraft design to Soviet agents, confessed in 1950 to FBI, and outed an entire intricate Soviet spy network. Klaus Fuchs, Manhattan Project physicist, who also worked in the sister project in the UK. And he passed atomic bomb secrets to the USSR, convicted and served 9 years in the UK, after which he migrated to East Germany and died in 1988. Alger Hiss, State Department, US State Department, and official at UN, convicted for perjury regarding spying for the USSR during the 1930s. His brother, Donald, was also a Soviet spy. And, it was good to note that both of these two brothers were graduates of the eminent Harvard Law School. Whittaker Chambers, journalist, Soviet spy, defected in 1938 and outed Hiss. Right? Alger Hiss was outed by Chambers. And then a lady, Elizabeth Bentley, CPUSA, Communist Party of USA member, and Soviet spy from 38 to 45, defected and outed 80 plus other spies, mostly in the US government. This is perhaps the origin, the concept of the idea of deep state, right? And then Nathan Gregory Silvermaster. This one is extremely important. He was the chief economist and war assets administrator in the US War Production Board during the Second World War. He was the head of a major Soviet spy ring within the US, known as the Silvermaster Group by later historians. And he was outed by Bentley, Elizabeth Bentley. And Harry Dexter White, Treasury Department official and mastermind of the US negotiating team at Bretton Woods, right? This was the conference held at the end of the Second World War to prepare for the international monetary order after the end of the war. He was outed by Bentley and Chambers, but he died before the conviction, but was later shown to be a Soviet spy in the Verona project. The Verona project was a project undertaken by US engineers to decipher Soviet and German fascist telegrams coded in secret ways, right? So it decoded many of those programs, telegrams, and found the names of these people and their activities all over the world, right? I think I missed listing here the very important couple, the Rosenberg couple, who was convicted of spying and sentenced to death, right? So this was a whole series of infiltration unearthed by the US authorities during that period. Now, that was the background that led to the so-called McCarthy hearings, right? But the immediate course of the McCarthy hearings was not the Soviet threats. In fact, it was a threat coming from China. And that was the story of the Amerasia espionage case of 1945. This was a magazine, a fairly highbrow magazine of area studies focusing on Asia, edited by a person called Philip Yaff. who was a friend of Edgar Snow, and who went to Yan'an and knew the crowd, the foreign crowd there, including people like Anna Louisa Strong, right? And then in his editorial board was this person, Ji Chao Ding, K. Chiu Ding. And he was a member of the CPUSA and a secret member of the Chinese Communist Party, right? He went back to China in before 1945, and he worked in the government. And he died in 1963, after which the Chinese Communist Party announced that he had been a party member for decades, right? So while he was working on the editorial board of the Amerasia magazine, he was a communist member. Now, the story about the Amerasia case was very interesting, in part because it was discovered by US intelligence agents to have amassed hundreds and hundreds of top secret documents from the various US government offices and agencies, right? So its offices was broken into, and photographs of those documents were taken, and they were used as evidence in a trial. But in that trial, it so happened that the prosecutors did not want to press too hard in order not to embarrass the Roosevelt government, already under criticism of being pro-socialist, right? And so the defendants in that trial, which included Philip Yap as the main culprit, got off the hook. He was fined $2,500, and that was it. All right. The rest of the defendants got off very easily, and 4 out of the 6 accused were declared innocent, including a very famous State Department China hand called John Service, right? Now, the result of the trial was deemed to be highly unsatisfactory by the conservatives in Congress, and therefore it resulted in the McCarthy hearings, right? Now, McCarthy was a junior first-term senator from the state of Wisconsin. He was inexperienced, and he had a very bombastic character. He did not do his homework well, and so the hearings contained a lot of mistakes. And of course, in his zeal to push prosecutions, he also used unreliable, sometimes fake data, right? And so the McCarthy hearings were reasonably criticized. Now, but to be fair, some of the fake data was later found to have been fed to McCarthy by the then CIA director. And why did that happen? Well, that was because McCarthy was accusing some of the members of the CIA staff as being communist spies, right? And he was trying to bring them to the hearings to question them. Now, President Roosevelt tried to put a stop to that. And the director of the CIA planted fake data in McCarthy's office, which he used to try to bring people to the hearings and accuse them of being Soviet spies. And when those data was revealed to be false, McCarthy was discredited. Now, those events were covered in some documents of the US government revealed to the public in the year 2004, right? About 50 years after the McCarthy hearings. Now, parallel to the McCarthy hearings was the passage of the Communist Control Act of 1954, supposedly designed to outlaw the Communist Party of the United States of America, the CPUSA, from taking part in elections, right? But this law never went into effect. Its wordings were too vague, and a lot of them were found to be unconstitutional. But if you look at the legislative history of this piece of legislation, it was a joke. It was a joke. It was proposed. The bill was proposed by a Democrat from the state of Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey, and he was doing that not because he wanted to control the Communist Party, the CPUSA, but because he wanted to give an opportunity to his fellow senators and congressmen to vote on something that looks like anti-communist, to show their anti-communist credentials, right? Because they had been criticized by the conservatives as being pro-socialist, pro-communist, right? So that was the origin of the Communist Control Act of 1954. It is still in the law books of the United States of America, but it has never been effectively invoked. It's a piece of actually a piece of junk. Now, later narrative of this string of incidents, the second dose of Soviet infiltration, and the Malaysia case leading up to the McCarthy hearings and the aftermath was dubbed the second Red Scare. All right. Now I put Red Scare in quotes because arguably it wasn't all a scare. There were very clear evidence of Soviet and Chinese infiltration, and a lot of the institutions were inside the government, top levels of the government. All right. If that was not a threat, what is it? All right. So it's much more than a scare. Now, I have all the elements ready now for looking at the tension between the US and China. Now, I guess I'm running a bit long in my presentation, but I'll speed it up. Now,
maybe another 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay? Thank you.
Now, so you have this Chinese expansionism. Driven by long historical behavioral patterns, and the US playing defense. Defense of a world order which it was instrumental in bringing about, right? So there's a tension between them. Now, in my prediction, in addition to a Cold War, some kind of limited hot war could well happen, right? For example, over the Taiwan Straits, right? The Taiwan issue. We know that tension has been very high across the straits, and there are daily incursions by Chinese Air Force and Navy crafts to interfere in the airspace and the maritime space of Taiwan. And in reaction, the US and its allies are sending more ships into the straits to the show force in an attempt to stop Chinese aggressive behavior. But at some point, probably it's going to boil over. All right. I have certain arguments that leads me to think that probably the Cold War is a better approach and should be used more to fend off a hot war, right? And it was, I think more or less in the following way. Cold War and hot war are strategic substitutes, right? So cold and hot wars are strategic substitutes. If you fight more Cold War, you don't have to fight that many hot wars, right? Or the probability of having to fight hot war would go down as this goes up, as this would go down, all right? More Cold War, less hot war. It's like, you know, if you are hungry and you can either eat hamburgers or sushi. So if you eat more hamburgers, you don't have to eat that many pieces of sushi, right? So they are substitutes in that sense, strategic substitutes. A different view says that Cold War and hot war are complements. If you fight Cold War, it would lead to high probability of hot war, right? So it's like if you smoke marijuana, then probably LSD and fentanyl and all kinds of other hard drugs would also be consumed more. In that case, they would be strategic complements, right? Cold War leading to more Cold War leading to hot war, and they would be strategic complements. But I think there are better arguments to say that cold and hot wars are strategic substitutes. In main part because fighting wars requires resources. So if you put more resources in fighting cold wars, you don't have that much resource to fight hot wars, and the probability of fighting a hot war would decrease, right? So I think fighting Cold War is actually a good thing, right? If you don't fight a Cold War, eventually you might have to fight a hot war, right? But then at some point, fighting Cold Wars would not be enough, and so it would boil over to hot war. But my guess, my assessment is that it would be a limited hot war. Now, given this scenario, if it comes to pass, all right, then two things would appear in the US. There would be revisionism. There would be a new, what I call a neo-McCarthyism. And there would be a new form of selective internment of US nationals with Chinese ethnic origin. Right? It probably would not be a replay of the Japanese American experience in 1942, but it would be some form of internment that I call internment light, all right, like Budweiser light. So these two kinds of revisionism would surface in the US, would arise in the US, right? There would be a new assessment of McCarthyism, and some form of McCarthyism would take place in the US, and leading to the internment of probably of US nationals with Chinese origin, right? Now, regarding the internment of foreign nationals with an origin in enemy countries, it's actually a very, very common thing. in the last 100 years, right? So let me show you some of the histories of internment. Now, if you look at the 20th century, especially the two world wars, internment was the rule rather than exception in all the major countries in the world over. All right. In the U.S., of course, there were 120 ethnic Japanese interned and 11,000 Germans and 1,800 Italians interned, right? Now, how about Canada? Canada interned 21,000 ethnic Japanese and 4,000 Ukrainians, right? And the UK interned 30,000 Germans, Austrians, and Italians. Australia, 12,000. How about Japan? Well, Japan interned 130,000 whites in all over Southeast Asia that had become occupied by Japanese forces, right? So these are the internments that occurred in the Second World War. How about First World War? Well, there were an internment of 400,000 Asian civilians, aside from the 9 million prisoners of war in Europe. So internments are not that rare. It didn't just happen in the US in a certain period of time, right? It was all over the place, right? So if a war between two major countries occur, internment is the rule rather than exception, right? It's not all racism, but it could lead to more racism, right? Now, those of you who are in Canada tend to think that Canada is a very enlightened country. But if you look at the experience of Japanese, ethnic Japanese internment in Canada, it was done in a way which was even more horrible than in the US. In the US, Japanese citizens, Japanese Americans were rounded up and left their homes and went into the concentration camps. They had to sell their houses, their homes, because they didn't know when they would return. And those properties were disposed of at very low prices, fireside sale, right? But then they still had something in return. I mean, they got the proceeds from the sales, which they used to start life all over again after the internment in when it ended in 1945. Not so in the case of the Japanese Canadians. They went into the concentration camps. The government sold their houses and homes and properties to pay for their expenses incurred when they were in the concentration camps. Now, so when these people came out from the Canadian concentration camps, they had literally nothing to start their new life with, right? So it was done in a very horrible way. Now, so this is my prediction. How likely is it going to be true? I have no idea. All right. I think reasonably there is a good chance that such events may happen. All right. Now, if something like that happens, what's going to happen within the diaspora? Well, within the Chinese diaspora, there will be repatriation, some voluntary, some forced. Right. There will be polarization. Some of the members of the Chinese diaspora would aggressively defend themselves legally, invoking constitutional law, right? Others would try to de-identify as Chinese, right? Now, the Falun Gong people have been doing something like that, and they encourage people to drop their CCP membership. But dropping the CCP membership does not de-identify yourself as Chinese, right? So I think that probably the Falun Gong would move one step further and encourage their members to de-identify themselves as Chinese if nothing happens, right? If there would be members of the Chinese diaspora outing others. And in other words, we will have equivalents of Chambers and Bentley, and they would provide very good drama for the press. Careers and businesses would be hurt, right? Within the Hong Kong diaspora, there would be further de-identification of Chineseness, right? According to the slogan put forward during the 2019 uprisings in the city. Hong Kong is not China, right? You're going to sell a lot of T-shirts with that kind of, with that slogan printed on it. There would be stronger pro-Hong Kong independence sentiments and groups springing up, right? And what about between Chinese and other diasporan groups? Tension with the whites would flare up, right? Would heighten. Whereas Chinese diaspora members would expect little help coming from the other diasporan communities, like the Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Indian, Tibetan, Uyghur, and Russian. Right? Why? Well, because all of these various diasporan communities have members with some degree of loyalty to their home country, to their mother countries, and their mother countries all have some kind of conflict with China, right? So to the extent that members of these diasporan communities still have a split loyalty, part of their loyalties belonging to their mother countries, they would probably look upon the conflict between the Chinese diaspora and American and the rest of American society with some degree of nonchalance, right? This is the end of my presentation. I'm sorry I have taken more time than allowed. I would be happy to field questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Lian. Let's see, that's good. So we have, I see that there are some comments and questions in the chat area already. And Professor Lian has mentioned that he prefers to see questions in writing. So we would like to, if you have any comments or questions, please put them in the chat area and we will direct them to Professor Lian's attention. So this is, so Professor Lian, there is, I think there are some questions already. If you look at the sheet or look at this, our group, you should be able to see some questions. Helena, would you like to tell us which question that that we would like Professor Lian to address first?
Maybe we can start with the general questions, like question 1.
Okay, question 1. So maybe I'll read the question.
Okay.
Who is included? Oh, you can.
Yeah, I got it. All right. Well, the figures 43 million to 60 million would include people in the diasporan communities of many countries, including those of Chinese descent in countries like Malaysia, right? So the question and the follow-up question of that is, at what point do diasporas stop becoming diaspora? Well, it's hard to say. It depends on a lot of factors, right? The strength of the identity to the mother country, right, or allegiance to the mother country. Your physical characteristics, right? Probably the community of German ethnic German people, let's say in the US, would merge into mainstream society, and the German diaspora would therefore disappear quicker, but not so for the Japanese, Chinese, etc. Second question. Economic repercussions into the Hong Kong Chinese. Well, the second question is whether the economic repercussions in well, it's very hard to say. Probably what's happening in the Chinese in the Chinese and Hong Kong diasporas would not affect the economies of Hong Kong or China. It's simply the tail of the tail cannot wag the dog, but the dog can wag the tail, right? The Chinese and Hong Kong diasporas are actually quite small compared to the populations in the size of the economies of their mother countries, right? So I would say no. What happens in the diaspora would hardly affect the economies of their mother countries. There's a question regarding the possibility of interning Chinese members of the Chinese diaspora, because it's so large. How can you intern several million people in the US, right? Well, that's why I say if an internment does occur, it's going to be selective, right? Now, how is it? How can that be done? Well, if you read intelligence reports that have been made public by the US intelligence community, you would know that at any time, the FBI is watching a number of people in these suspect communities, and they have they already have a list, a black list or gray list or whatever, right? And it is, those are lists that would be actionable in case of a conflict between the two countries, one of them being the mother country of the people on the list. So if the FBI has such a gray list for ethnic Chinese operating in the interest of China in the United States, which I think there must be, and it's not going to be a short list, right? It's going to be a fairly long list. In case of a severe conflict between China and the US, the FBI would therefore immediately put the list of those the people on those lists into some kind of internment, and that's quite possible. All right, that's doable, right?
I guess one way, Professor Lian, one way to follow up Professor Yan's question about internment, the possibility of internment, is we know that there are now subtle ways to scare off Americans of Chinese background to deal with sensitive matters such as basic science or technologies that seem to be of strategic interest. So instead of interning, right, really locking people up, do you see the trend of harassing people of Chinese background becoming even, that would be the main channel of a new form of McCarthyism? Do you think that is actually going to be even more prominent going forward, or more possible going forward?
Well, given the large number of ethnic Chinese employed in various industries and professions in the US, it is very difficult to even have a comprehensive blacklist for each one of those industries, right? So I think if it happens, it would have to be highly selective, but it's going to have very strong spillover effect on the entire community. It's, I think government action is one kind of harm that can be inflicted on the Chinese diaspora. The reaction from the rest of society, right, likely to be negative, given the current sentiment towards China. That kind of negative sentiment may well impose an even higher cost on the Chinese diaspora, and by association, the Hong Kong diaspora. Now, this is a very dire prediction, and I hope it would not come to pass, but my assessment is that it may well come to pass.
I noticed there is a question about the possible increase in number of Hong Kong diaspora around the world. The question is, so Professor Lian, are you expecting more and more people leaving Hong Kong? I think that's a question I think many of us are wondering. We have our own guesses, but what is your take?
Well, if you look at the UK, there is a prediction that up to 200,000 people would leave Hong Kong for that country. And that number would triple the size of the Hong Kong community in the UK, right? So it's a very, very big increase, and I think that may well happen. You're seeing a steady flow of immigrants to the UK now, but from anecdotes gathered from my friends and relatives, many people are actually making the preparations to leave. Now, it takes time, of course, because you have to leave your job, you have to dispose of your property, and you have to plan your future in a new country. So all this would take time. And so some people may have done it faster, some people are still doing it. And so we will see continuation of the outflow for quite some time to come yet, right? Now, there's a question about the constitutionality of internment, whether such actions are still possible in today's climate, which is much more enlightened than in, let's say, the 1940s. Now, the thing is, there's always a tension between constitutional rights and national security, all right? In times of war, you always see the heavier weight being put on national security, and constitutional rights for certain people with certain characteristics could be temporarily suspended, right? Arguably, this is not altogether illegal. And in times of severe national conflicts, a good part of the people in the respective countries would even agree to that kind of a suspension of constitutional rights for a period of time on a certain part of the population, right? So it's not unimaginable, even in today's relatively enlightened climate, that such a thing could occur. Could people that Japanese Americans would be interned on such a large scale in the year 1942, but it happened, right? It happened. So I think history may repeat itself, but of course not altogether in exactly the same way.
I know there are other questions, but I want to jump to the last question in the chat area first, if I may. So the question asked, in your opinion, how would Hong Kongers de-identify their Chineseness? And how will the mainstream society see such de-identification?
Well, I guess de-identification could be in many levels, right? The most immediate level is at workplace, for example, right? Something nasty happens between the US and China. And if you go back to work in your office, right, and see that you look like a Chinese, and they may react in a certain way, which you think would be uncomfortable to you, right? So what you may have to do is to de-identify yourself as Chinese in that kind of environment, right? And which is not too difficult to do, right? Because of the close range relationships. People understand you, people have been friendly to you, and if you expect that that's business, right? I'm not quite a Chinese, then it's doable, right? Now, on a different level, right? As a community, how do you do that? Well, that has to be done in some form of political activism. You have to have groups of people coming out together, working together and make declarations. You have to do that. And that happened actually during the Japanese American internship in the Second World War, right? There was this polarization among the Japanese American community. Some people had very hard feelings against the internment, of course, right? A lot of people had very hard feelings. But then there were a group of Japanese, primarily younger Japanese people, who declared themselves, we are not Japanese. We are 100% Americans. Don't mistake us, right? Our allegiance is not split. We profess 100% allegiance to America, right? That happened, right? So the same thing could happen in the Chinese diaspora if things get ugly, right? So the identification can proceed at different levels. But renouncing one's Chineseness does not imply that you negate everything Chinese, right? I don't think so. For instance, there are many good elements from the Chinese culture that we can still retain, even if we don't regard ourselves as Chinese, right? In this age of multiculturalism, I think every one of us partakes foreign cultures to different degrees. If you ask me, for example, what are my inherent cultural mix, right? What are the values, cultural values that I partake? I can tell you that one half of it is Chinese, the other half is Western, right? So I'm not going to give up many of the good elements of Chinese culture that I partake, that I like, that I enjoy, that I find precious, right? But if you ask me, do you consider yourself a Chinese? Then I would say rather not, right? I'm a Hong Kong person.
Thank you. Now, there are a couple other questions. One has to do with comparison. So if you go back up a list, one of the audience members asked, how would you compare the sentiments and ideologies between the Chinese diasporas and other diasporas? I think the examples given in the question is South Asian, Filipinos. I think this is in the context of the United States. So I guess the question is about comparing Chinese diasporas, including Hong Kong, and other diasporic groups in the United States. Are there any particular distinct characteristics for the Chinese and Hong Kong diasporas? Or
I guess the Hong Kong diaspora has a better capabilities to merge into into Western societies, right? In other words, the kind of transnationalism that members of the new Hong Kong diaspora carry with them is not in conflict with a new Western identity that these people would acquire, right? Simply because Hong Kong has been so Westernized that people in Hong Kong have been so used to Western ideas, Western customs, habits, values, right? Rule of law, democracy, an open press, the freedoms, right? Academic freedom, press freedom, and so on and so forth, right? So these are the things that members of the Hong Kong diaspora carry with them when they leave home, right? Not so with the diaspora. Now, of course, they are pro-democracy members of the Chinese diaspora. But if we are honest, we have to admit that the 1989 Tiananmen crowd has essentially disappeared, right? So, and they have been replaced by a new generation of immigrants from China whose transnationalism has a strong pro-China, pro-communist, pro-CCP element in it. And that kind of make it difficult for these people to really merge into Western society and identify with it, right? So there's a distinction, a cultural distinction, a deep cultural distinction between the Chinese diaspora, the main portion of the Chinese diaspora, and the new Hong Kong diaspora.
I'm mindful that there are some other questions in the chat area, but I'm also mindful of time. But I have some questions that I think it is, since it's such a rare treat to have you with us, and there are some questions that I really would like to ask you to share your thoughts with our audience, which is, I mean, the very obvious question is, what are your thoughts on what is happening in Hong Kong in the last year? I know you have written many pieces on it. I know it's a very tough question, but it is something that we like to hear your thoughts. So what are yeah, it's a very general question, but it's something that I think our audience is all very
the changes in Hong Kong have been momentous, right? And one of the things it did to the diaspora is the following. If you look at the history of Hong Kong, it is a very important part of the Chinese diaspora. Think of a diaspora as being formed as a result of push factors and pull factors, right? Now, the push factors are mainly bad factors, right? And they existed and they worked to push people out, right, from China. The pull factors are mostly good, comparatively speaking, right? For example, a better livelihood possibility in the West, or a better educational opportunity for the children of the migrants, etc. Right? So you can think of diaspora as the equilibrium of the accumulated push factors and pull factors that has occurred throughout history. Now, in the Chinese diaspora, Hong Kong essentially played for a very long time a pull factor. People leaving China were attracted by the good things in Hong Kong, right? So Hong Kong has been a pull factor of the Chinese diaspora. It has also been a transit point, a safe passage, a stepping stone for people leaving China as a result of the push factors, right? So traditionally, Hong Kong played two roles: provider of a pull factor and provider of safe passage, stepping stone for people leaving China and going into the Chinese diaspora. But since last year, since the promulgation of the national security law, that changed. Hong Kong itself became a push factor. That was unprecedented, first time in history. And that was a sea change, a very deep change, right? The only exception I could remember of Hong Kong being a push factor, pushing people out, was the short period of time under the Japanese occupation during the Second World War, when some people left Hong Kong for their hometowns in China or Southeast Asia, right? Now, Hong Kong has become something like that. And it's not a foreign government, like a foreign regime like the Japanese occupation authority, right? Now, but the perception is changing. Same thing happened. Hong Kong becoming a push factor. So people are thinking that, well, the government, the regime in Hong Kong today is an alien regime, just like the Japanese occupation authority. 外來政權. Right? So that is the change being, the change taking place in Hong Kong.
That's a very good point, right? As you mentioned, that it was during World War II, Japanese occupation of Hong Kong was the time, right? Was the time when people left Hong Kong in drove, whether voluntarily or by force. So that's really another example that I can think of. That's true. So I'm mindful of time, but there's one last question. Again, I'm channeling the thoughts of my real or imagined audience, which is because one of the pieces that you wrote about Hong Kong diaspora, I think I forgot when, but I remember reading it. It was in Chinese, and that was one of the reasons why I thought I really want to invite you to come give a talk. So the question really is about, so the fact that there is now a Hong Kong diaspora, that there are more and more people leaving Hong Kong. And you can see around us, I don't know whether it is true in Japan or not, but there are various groups, informal groups or sometimes more formal groups emerging in Canada, in UK, formed by members of the Hong Kong diaspora. What do you think they should do or they are able to do? I know it's another very general questions, but it is something, it is happening that I can see around us, again, in Canada and elsewhere. So, and I think you have some thoughts about this. So anyway, please share.
Yes. Actually, there are a lot of things that people in the Hong Kong diaspora can do in the countries that they have settled in, but there are other things that they cannot do. right? Things they can do with fall into categories. Maintenance things, right? Like helping the new arrivals, keeping the Hong Kong heritage alive, right? Teaching Hong Kongese to your children, speaking the language at home, right? These are the maintenance things that you can do, right? Another kind of things would be to help Hong Kong, to help the people still remaining in Hong Kong to defend themselves against the onslaught of a government which is becoming more and more authoritarian every day, right? Now, this is very difficult to do, in part because we Hong Kongers have very little experience dealing with authoritarian governments, right? Now, I would say that in order to gain skills and know how to deal with authoritarian governments, actually some of the members in our Hong Kong diaspora should migrate to some authoritarian countries, live there for a number of years, observe how those governments govern, how oppression is done, how people organize to resist that kind of oppression, and learn from them. And probably maybe they can help the people back home in Hong Kong better, right? By living in democratic countries, you do not learn how to fight authoritarian governments. That's an irony, all right? Yes, it gives you the freedom, but it also inhibits your ability to help those still being left behind, right? Go to Cuba.
Oh, yeah.
Go to North Korea, right? Study how they govern, how they oppress people, and how people there can fight back. I lived there for 10 years, maybe 5 years, right? And then you can better help the people in Hong Kong.
That's a challenge. That's a challenge. I want to thank you for your time, Professor Lian. I also want to say, since you did mention briefly Japanese internment in Canada, it is a painful episode in the history of Canada, and there have been ways for the government to address the issue. So in some way, yes, it is something, it is a dark episode in Canadian history. But yeah. I think it's fair to say that the government has gone in some way to address that, at least to acknowledge that. So that's something, because it's in your discussion, I thought I should mention it as well. So it's 9 o'clock. Thank you.
Professor Shin, you are going to put the recording of this seminar on your website, right? Actually, yes. I can send the set of slides that I have prepared so that you can also put it on your website. I showed some of the slides, but perhaps more of them I did not have time to go over. So anyone interested in looking into more details about the I had intended to say could check out the slides, right?
Thank you very much, and I very much appreciate it. Yes, so for our audience, would like to revisit the talk. We will put it up at some point, and just come to our website and you'll find the information. So I think we are reaching the end of our talk. Again, before I formally adjourn, I would just say thank you, Professor Lian, for taking the time to speak to us, and share your thoughts. I want to thank my student helpers, Sonia and Justin, for helping us out as well. And I also want to thank all our audience for staying with us for 2 hours on a Friday evening. So very much appreciated. So please join me in thanking Professor Lian.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.